Hi, boys and girls. Welcome to Storytime with Nonie. They finally arrived at a rocky path that led them straight up, kind of like this. When Much Afraid saw it, oh my goodness, she began wondering, how in the world are we ever going to be able to get up there? And the more she looked at it, the more anxious and worried she got. And pretty soon she started doubting. Much Afraid told Sorrow and Suffering, "There is no way we can climb that. It is much too steep. We're going to have to turn around and go back." Well, Suffering was watching, and all of a sudden she pointed. Much Afraid turned to look where she was pointing, and there were two deer, a hart and a hind, just leaping right up that rocky wall. And Suffering said, "See, we aren't going to have to turn around after all, Much Afraid. The deer have shown us the way to go." But Much Afraid, she just sat down and she just began to cry. She was so discouraged. Much Afraid said, "The deer may be able to go up there, but I have crippled feet. I can't go leaping up that path that they went up." And she just continued to cry. Well, all of a sudden, they heard the rattling of stones. And before you knew it, here came Craven Fear. He got right in Much Afraid's face and he said, "Hello there, my little cousin. Did you think that you could escape me forever? You know, Much Afraid, you are one of the fearing relatives and you are never going to change. What do you think, that you're going to be able to go up that rocky wall? I don't think so. I can just see you now, starting to climb. You turn around and you look down, and all of a sudden in your head, all you see are pictures of yourself falling and stumbling. Oh, you will never be able to go up that rocky wall." Much Afraid said her helpers, "You know what to do. Call for the shepherd right now. Call for help." Much Afraid said, "I can't do it. I just can't do it. I'm afraid if I call the shepherd, he's going to tell me that I have to go up there. And this is one time I just can't do it." And Craven Fear was like, "Yes!" And he jumped right in her face. And just as he was getting ready to grab her, Sorrow and Suffering stepped between Much Afraid and Craven Fear. And then Suffering looked at Sorrow. Sorrow nodded her head, and Suffering poked Much Afraid like only Suffering can do. And it hurt, and Much Afraid went, "Ow!" And then she did what she should have done in the very beginning. She yelled out, "Shepherd, come help me! My fears are too much for me to bear." And as soon as she called out to the shepherd, Craven Fear scurried away as fast as he could. And don't you know, the shepherd was right there. And he said, "Hello, Much Afraid." Just the sound of his cheery voice began to help Much Afraid to gain some strength and courage. She looked at the shepherd and he was smiling at her. He wasn't angry at all that she had listened to her fears. And it melted the icy fear around her heart. And the shepherd said, "Much Afraid, what is it that you're so fearful of?" And she said, "Oh, shepherd, it's this way you've chosen for me to go. I can't go up there. My feet are crippled and I'm like a little jellyfish. I can't go climbing up that rocky wall. I don't know what in the world you're thinking." And the shepherd said, "Well, Much Afraid, first of all, let's think about this a little bit. You began to worry about climbing that wall, didn't you?" "Yes, of course I was worried." "And Much Afraid, once you started to worry, you started to become doubtful, didn't you? You began to think it would be impossible, didn't you?" Oh, yeah, look at it. Much afraid. Then that doubt. What happened after you worried and you doubted? Oh, I opened up the door for fear, craven fear, to come, didn't I? He said, yes, you did, Much afraid. But next time, maybe when you begin to worry, you'll start to call me right away instead of waiting. And she said, yeah, I think that would be the best thing, but Sir Shepherd, how in the world can I get up there? And he said, Much afraid, what were the promises that I made to you in the valley? Well, you promised me that you would give me Hind's feet. He said, that's right, so that you could go places that seemed impossible for you to go without them. The only way I can fulfill my promise to you is for you to begin going along the path that I've set before you. Much afraid said, you know, then I just don't think I really want Hind's feet, Shepherd. And he laughed. Can you imagine? He laughed. He said, oh, Much afraid, I know you better than you know yourself. And you know what? You do want Hind's feet. And she said, oh, Shepherd, I never dreamed that you were going to do this. I never dreamed you were going to give me Hind's feet by making me climb up a rocky wall like this. Whatever are you going to do next? And he laughed. He said, you know what, Much afraid, I love doing things that just don't seem to make any sense. He says, I love taking weakness and turning it into strength. I love taking fear and turning it into faith. Believing you can do something you don't think you can do. I love taking Much afraid, for instance, and turning her into... Well, you know what? I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to turn her into. You're going to have to wait and see. What a difference the shepherd had made. Just a short time ago, she had been sitting on the rocks, crying, full of fear and worry. And now she and the shepherd were sitting on the rocks, just laughing. And he said, Much afraid, do you believe that I will help you go up this rocky wall like I'm asking you to do? She said, yes, I do, Shepherd. Much afraid knelt down, and she built a little altar like she had done. And on that altar, she took her will, the things that she wanted, which were different than what the shepherd wanted. She placed her will, her choices and decisions on that altar. And a little fire came along and burned it up. And what was left was a little rock, and she picked that rock up, and she said, I'm going to put this in my pouch. The shepherd said, Much afraid, I want you to start on this path right now. This mountain that you're going to begin to climb is called Mount Injury. Injury means pain, that you have been hurt. That does not sound like a good mountain to climb. Your Much afraid thought she was going to be climbing good mountains. But this was Mount Injury, the way the shepherd had told her to go. And he said, Much afraid, you need to start climbing right away because you're fearing relatives. If you stay down here tonight, your fearing relatives will come back. But partway up the mountain, you will come to a cave and you can stay there tonight. And tomorrow morning, you can begin to climb again until you reach the top. And then the shepherd picked up a little bottle and he said, Much afraid, I'm going to give you a very special gift. This is the spirit of grace. Whenever you're hurt, whenever you are weak, just take a few sips of this and it will help you feel strong again. And right then, she took a few drops of it, and immediately she felt strengthened. She felt all of a sudden like it would be possible for her to climb. And so the shepherd took sorrow and suffering, and he tied a rope from sorrow to Much afraid, around Much afraid, and to suffering. And he said, off you go now. And the three of them began climbing up Mount Injury. Much Afraid and her friends, Sorrow and Suffering, climbed up the rock wall, and Much Afraid was very surprised at how easily she was able to climb that wall. At one point, Much Afraid looked down, and she was so very glad that they had listened to the shepherd and began climbing when he told them to, because there, sitting on a rock, down, down, down in the valley, was her fearing relatives. All 5 of them just sitting there on a rock, looking angrily up at her. Well, pretty soon, Much Afraid and her helpers reached the cave that the shepherd had told them about. Next to it was this beautiful little waterfall, and they drank from that stream and felt all refreshed. And then they went into the cave, and after they ate, they went to sleep. Early the next morning, Much Afraid woke up, and she went to the door of the cave and looked out. As far as she could see was the sea of loneliness and the desert that she had walked through. And Much Afraid climbed out of the cave and was sitting beside the waterfall when she happened to notice a beautiful little flower. She had never seen anything like that flower before, and she said, "Little flower, what is your name?" And it said, "My name is Bearing with Love, but some call it Forgiveness." Much Afraid said, "Why is that your name?" The little flower said, "A long time ago, I was taken away from my family and friends, and I was put here in this crack in the rock. And I chose not to be angry and bitter at those who did that to me. I chose to love. And pretty soon, that love drew me up out of that pit. Now, there is not a flower that is anywhere near as content and happy as I am." Much Afraid thought for a moment, and she said, "I want to be able to forgive and love also. I want to be bearing with love." And just about that time, a little piece of rock fell off of the wall in front of Much Afraid. She picked it up and she said, "I'm going to keep this little rock to remind me that I want to forgive when people hurt me." And she put that rock in her little pouch with the other ones to remind her of that lesson. Much Afraid and Sorrow and Suffering began to climb again after they had their breakfast, when all of a sudden, Much Afraid slipped and fell and cut her leg on a jagged rock. Oh, it hurt so bad. It was bleeding, and she sat crouching on the ledge of that rocky cliff, afraid that she was going to fall because she was feeling so weak and so hurt. And Suffering comes and says, "Much Afraid, get that the bottle of Spirit of Grace and Comfort." And Much Afraid said, "I don't even know where it is." And Suffering reached down into Much Afraid's pocket and pulled it out, opened it up, and gave Much Afraid a few little drops. And that helped a little bit. She drank a little bit more and she felt strengthened. And after a little bit, the pain wasn't so bad. But she had to really battle that fear because she was so afraid she was going to fall. She could see in her mind just what Craven Fear had told her. And she thought, "No, I'm not gonna be afraid. I'm gonna trust this is the way the Lord wants me to go. This is the way the shepherd told me to go. And I am going to get up and I'm going to keep climbing." And so Much Afraid took hold of Sorrow and Suffering's hands, and they pulled her up, and they began climbing again. But it was so slow, very, very slow, because Much Afraid, her knees and legs were so stiff. Finally, Much Afraid said, "What were you doing at the waterfall this morning?" they continued to climb, began thinking about it, and she realized she had began to be a little angry with the shepherd for telling her to go up this Mount Injury. And she realized she didn't need to forgive the shepherd because he hadn't done anything wrong, but she needed to bear with love this place that the shepherd had put her in, and much afraid, made up her mind, her will, to choose to love the shepherd and to accept with joy, even though she didn't feel joyful, this way that he had set before her. And so they kept climbing, and after that they were able to go a little bit faster. Well, it wasn't long after that they reached the top. Much afraid and sorrow and suffering, pleasantly surprised when they got to the top and were sitting on this mossy rock. Who do you think they heard coming, singing? It was the shepherd. Oh, and he said, "Much afraid, I am so proud of you. I am so pleased with you. You made it to the top of Mount Injury." And she said, "Yes, but shepherd, look at my knees." And you know what he did? He reached over and he put his hands on her knees, and immediately they healed completely up. They didn't hurt anymore. They weren't stiff anymore. She was healed. That's another thing the shepherd loves to do. So he sat down with her on top of the mossy rock, and they began to talk. And he told her, "Much afraid? Now I'm going to have you walking along up here. You're going to go through the forest of danger and tribulation." Ah! Tribulation? That means big trouble. She said, "Oh, shepherd, you always surprise me. And you know what? I choose to go wherever you want me to go. I will go through the forest of danger and tribulation, and I know that even if I get afraid, I do not have to give in to that fear. And I'm going to call out to you when I begin to get afraid right away, because I know you want me to tell you how I feel, because that's when you change my feelings." Again, will choose not to be afraid to follow you, because I love you, shepherd.